as well. We always invite you for after the service to join us for coffee, a UU ritual, and hello, Bob. Okay, how's that? Thank you. No, all right. Whew. That does make a difference, doesn't it? Wow. All right. Well, anyway, we look forward to getting to know you. Now we have a few announcements. The first from our stewardship campaign.
Schoolhouse Link is a social justice project dedicated to helping eliminate child hunger in Sarasota County. Our congregation provides homeless children with food baskets for emergency situations and welcome home baskets for families who have just found housing.
Over the past year, the UU community has supported also youth in a number of ways.
For 2 years now, we have shown our commitment to racial justice by sponsoring a panel at Embracing Our Differences. This year's panel was inspired by Nobel Prize winner Toni Morrison's book, The Bluest Eye.
You probably don't realize it if you haven't been out in the community or if you haven't lived here very long, but in this area of great wealth, there is tremendous food insecurity. Lots of children are hungry. Our backpack program is a partnership with All Faiths Food Bank, which is the only food bank in the area, to provide students with nutritious food for when they are out of school and on weekends. We pack with about 15 to 20 people once a month, 1,200 or so bags of food. And that's why I've joined UUCS, to make a difference, because we don't just talk the talk, we walk the walk.
And if you haven't yet, please, we invite you to pledge and be as generous as you can. This helps us plan our budget, which we will be voting on next week. And you can get one of these either online or right outside. I'm sure there is a table. We have many tables outside after service. I'm assuming one of them is for stewardship. I also want to have a quick announcement from the Art Council. We invite you to stop into the Lexow Gallery after the service today for the opening reception of Her Shoes in the Alley, an exhibit of photo-based art by UUCS member Donald Diddams. Don says, I work with the images to show not only what I saw, but also some of what I felt. And I did just take a quick tour of it on my way here, and really is worth seeing. But also including questions about our values, our beliefs, and our future during this time of rapid change. The exhibit also includes some sculptures by the artist, Cheryl, I hope I do not mispronounce this, Shakanovsky. She's an award-winning sculpture and portrait artist. One other announcement, and the exhibit will be up until April 13th, and so please come and support our fellow members in the Art Council. Two other quick announcements. I'm very, very pleased to announce that Don Bryn has accepted the position of choir director, and yeah. And whatever else he is willing to do musically with us, so as time for. And one last thing, please remember, next week we go back to one service at 10:30, and we will have our annual meeting after the service next week. So remember to set your alarm clock so you can get here. And forum will be at 9:15 to give you time to get coffee in between forum And imagine if you're a foreign person, you're probably not here, and that'll be better for the second service. So anyway, now let us rise in body and or spirit for our opening hymn number 298, Wake Now My Senses. Our opening reading today is from William Ellery Channing's Likeness to God. I must revere human nature. I bless it for its kind affections, for its strong and tender love. I honor it for its struggles against oppression, for its growth and progress under the weight of so many chains and prejudices, for its achievements in science and art, and still more, for its examples of heroic and saintly virtue. These are the marks of a divine origin and the pledges of a celestial inheritance. And I thank God that my own lot is bound up with that of the human race. And now I invite up Anna, who will light our chalice. As we light the chalice, please join me in saying the words of affirmation, which are printed in your order of service and will be on the screen. It is on the screen behind me. As we light this chalice, the symbol of Unitarian Universalism, we affirm our third principle, courage and to spiritual growth in our congregation.
Seems low to me. Welcome to all of you on this chilly Florida morning. Today's book, Henry Builds a Cabin by D.B. Johnson. So one spring day, Henry decided to build a cabin. He borrowed an axe and cut down 12 trees. He cut the logs into square beams. He notched the bottom beams to fit into the corner posts, and the corner posts fit into the ceiling beams, and the ceiling beams fit into the roof beams. In April, his friend Emerson helped raise the beams. The work made him hungry. "Henry," he said, "your cabin looks too small to eat in." "It's bigger than it looks," said Henry. And he led his friend to a bean patch he had planted behind the cabin. "When it's finished, this will be my dining room." In May, Henry bought an old shed and took it apart, and he nailed the boards onto the floor, the roof, and the walls of his cabin. Henry was nailing the last board in when his friend Alcott arrived. "Henry," he said, "your cabin looks too dark to read in." "Oh, it's brighter than it looks," said Henry, and he led his friend to a sunny spot beside the cabin. "When it's finished, this will be my library." In June, Henry put a door on in the front, and then he put 2 used windows in the side walls. He bought old shingles for the roof and walls. Henry was nailing the last shingle when Miss Lydia peeked in the window. "Henry," she said, "your cabin looks too small to dance in." "Oh, it's bigger than it looks," said Henry. And he led her to the front of the cabin where a path curved down to the pond. "And when it's finished, this will be the ballroom with a grand stairway." On the 4th of July, Henry moved into his cabin. He ate beans in his dining room. He read in his library. And he danced down the grand staircase to the pond. And when it started to rain, Henry ran back to his cabin. "It's bigger than it looks," he said. "This is just the room I wear when it's raining." So many of you may have recognized that this story is based on the life of Henry David Thoreau and his famous 2-year experiment on living frugally and sustainably and with only the essentials on Walden Pond in Massachusetts. Clearly, Henry was channeling the future Marie Kondo by having only a bed, a desk, a table, and 3 chairs in his 10-foot by 15-foot cabin. Instead of working 6 days on and 1 day off, as was the norm back then, Henry decided, "I'm going to change that up." He worked as little as possible. He spent time outside observing nature. He did a lot of self-reflection, and he published his philosophies. So Henry was part of this Transcendentalist movement, which was going on back then, which believes that people have knowledge about themselves and the world around them that transcends or goes beyond what we can hear or see or taste or touch or feel. Science and reason cannot explain everything. Our inner feelings and intuitions are just as important. And with this self-reflection came questioning the rules of society. Many followers of this movement went on to lead other movements for progress, such as women's rights, abolition, and education reforms. And even though Henry became one of the original nuns, as in N-O-N-E, by quitting his Unitarian faith and all religion, it is clear that the influence he and the other Transcendentalists have on our principles and purposes today is clear. So now I invite our younger UUs to join me in the West Wing before we go to their separate classes, excuse me, to learn more about vulnerability and the hoodwinked effect. Thank you.
Yeah, they don't talk about when Thoreau went back home to get meals when he was hungry. I'll just say that. So now for our centering in words, I share this prayer. Spirit of life and love, known by many names and known in many ways, we come together today to seek wisdom, comfort, inspiration, and community. Let us not mistake difference with division. Let us let go of rigid idols that once served us. And let us be open to new ideas and ways of being. Let us look inward to find our truth, and then let us share our truth with others. May all our truths form one universal truth that leads us to the path of love. As we go into a time of silence, let us contemplate how we can respond with love to all the suffering that is in the world. All this I ask in your name. Amen. So sometimes it is important to look back on the path we have traveled to better help us see the path forward. Mark Twain once said that history never repeats itself, but it often rhymes. So today, I am going to share with you some of the formative history, particularly from our Unitarian ancestors, to shed some light on where we find ourselves now. And we can trace the origin of Unitarian thought all the way back to the early Christian sects at the time of Jesus, which really did not get suppressed until the Council of Nicaea in 325. It became formally named religion during the Protestant Reformation in Europe during the 16th century. Martin Luther, who was one of the leaders of the Protestant Reformation, challenged many of the practices of the Catholic Church. And with the advent of the printing press and the rise of literacy rates, Luther believed that everyone should have the right to read and interpret the Bible. And previously in Christianity, interpretation of the Bible had been controlled by Catholic priests. And yet, surprisingly, Luther was really shocked that everybody did not interpret the Bible the same way that he did. It's just shocking. And of course, as each group of people interpreted the Bible differently, separate denominations in Christianity were formed. The splintering of the various denominations continued over time and included what is called the radical Protestant Reformation, of which the Unitarians were a part of that group. Now, sadly, this led to tremendous bloodshed in Europe, and although Unitarianism was constantly suppressed in Europe, it found really fertile soil for its beliefs during the founding of the United States, with its focus on political and religious freedom. And in the United States, prior to 1825, Unitarian was part of the mainline Congregational Church in New England, which included both Unitarian and Trinitarian theologies, a belief, God, Father, Son, Holy Ghost, three in one, Trinitarian, Unitarian, meaning one. So different interpretations and thoughts emerged, which caused a fracture in the relationship between the Unitarians and the Trinitarians. And although there were theological differences that over the years, the seminal issue that started the separation was when Unitarian Minister Andrews Norton was appointed the Dean of the Harvard Divinity School. And Norton was a harsh critic of religions that believed in the predetermination of the soul, Calvinism, which many of the Trinitarians followed. Now, Norton's appointment led Trinitarians to start up their own seminary, and that heightened the ongoing friction between the Trinitarian and Unitarian ministers and congregants. And just a fun fact, that seminary, which was Andover Newton, just recently closed. I point out Harvard is still standing. When a congregation, though, in Dedham, Massachusetts, was in search of a minister, certain members wanted to call a Unitarian minister, and this caused many Trinitarians to leave and to start their own separate congregation. And in the early 1800s, it's very interesting how in Massachusetts, governance of churches was structured in something called the standing order. And everyone in town was part of the standing order, whether you went to church or didn't go to church, and you had to pay tax, and from those taxes, monies went to all the churches in town. And when the Trinitarians left to start their own congregation, well, a conflict arose regarding who would receive this tax money, and the building, and even the silver communion, which the Trinitarians took from the building in Dedham, Massachusetts. This dispute went all the way up to the Supreme Court, and in 1818, the court found for the Unitarian congregants. Just to say, if this court case was decided differently, it's possible we would not be a separate denomination today. So Supreme Court justices matter, as we found out again more recently. This decision accelerated the separation of the Unitarian and the Trinitarian congregational churches. And in 1825, the American Unitarian Association was formed. And then not long after, in 1833, the standing order and public funding of churches was eliminated. So, we talk about the separation of church and state, but at the early part of our country, that actually was not the case, although that was the intention of our founders. But the silver communion plates were never returned. Although the building stayed with the Unitarians and the money went to the Unitarians, the silver communion plates were never returned until they mysteriously reappeared 100 years later at a museum. So I'm assuming the next generation said, okay, that's enough. But this historical background of the deconstruction of early American religion will help you better understand the challenges that the Unitarians then faced when the Transcendentalist movement started. So approximately 10 years after the Unitarians formed their own denomination, the younger ministers started what became known as the Transcendentalist Club. And they would meet in people's homes, maybe a dozen at a time, to really just talk and brainstorm about ideas. And the Transcendentalists believed that religion should not create fear, but should inspire people to transform themselves. Transcendentalism's basic premise was that humans have within themselves the capacity to understand God without a mediator. And the Transcendentalists were the first ministers to incorporate literature, biblical criticism, and Eastern religious thought into the American religious landscape. So again, remember, this is like the 1830s and 40s that this had started. We may take all of that for granted today, but back then that was really considered heretical, even amongst Unitarians. The religious education methods introduced by the Transcendentalists focused on uncovering and developing children's natural abilities through interactions with others in the world. These are methods we still incorporate today in our religious education programs. And one of the other major changes brought on by the Transcendentalists was a focus on social justice. Their theology was based on German idealism, specifically Kant's categorical imperative. Reverend John Behrens wrote, "This philosophy guided Transcendentalists," and I quote, "to treat others, including children, the poor, women, the enslaved, not as mere objects, but as subjects, as moral agents whose spiritual and moral potential was to be given opportunity and encouraged," end quote. Transcendentalists believed there was an ultimate truth in the world, and they believed that ultimate truth could not be learned solely by reading ancient books or by events that happened in the past. Truth, they felt, is eternal and could be discerned by each individual and can be expressed in multiple ways. So think about how we talk about multiculturalism today. Truth being expressed in multiple ways. They were talking about this in the 1800s. Fresh from the wounds, though, of splitting with the Trinitarians, the Unitarians were now faced with the exact charge that was hurled at them from the Trinitarians. When you allow free religious exploration, right, just how far down the rabbit hole are you going to go, right? Clearly, fairly far, as we look at today. And so back then, though, fear rose up in the Christian Unitarians, and they put pressure then on the Transcendentalists to quit. And although the most famous of the Transcendentalists are Emerson and Thoreau, they were never institutionalists, ever. There were many other younger ministers and lay people, especially women, who really tried to institutionalize the Transcendentalism. The most ardent and outspoken Transcendentalist minister was Theodore Parker, and he was a fervent abolitionist. He once told a gathering of Christian Unitarian ministers who were trying to tell him he should quit, he said that he would quit only if they admitted that they had no right to kick him out. So, and they didn't do that. So he stayed in relationship, but eventually left his small Unitarian congregation that was about 90% funded by his mother-in-law, by the way, which was why he was able to get away with these things. But then he went on to form his own independent congregation in Boston, which actually was the first mega church in the United States. It literally, depending on like how big is that fish, some stories say it was 2,000, then 3,000, 5,000 people. But there were multiple thousands of people who would attend every week, and half of them were African Americans who came to hear his sermons on abolition. It is said he preached 3 to 4 hours every Sunday. I promise you I won't do that. And I don't think you would stay if I did. Yet Unitarians would not allow that congregation into the association because they believed Parker was too controversial. Many adherents to Parker's transcendentalist and justice vision were forced out of their pulpits and moved west in order to preach their transcendentalist message. They eventually then formed the Western Unitarian Conference, which for a while actually separated themselves from the American Unitarian Association and the Boston hierarchy. Others formed a new denomination called the Free Religious Association. And sadly, the sad effect of that, of the men moving west, these ministers, because many of the Western pulpits were served by women, actually. And that was where women first got into ministry in Unitarianism. But when all these men were forced out west, they ended up taking over most of those pulpits. Yeah, but one day I'll do a sermon on the Iowa sisterhood, and it's really an inspiring story. Over time, though, realizing the benefits and effectiveness of organizing power and money, Unitarian leadership sought to mend these fences. Henry Bellows, who was an institutionalist, he created the National Conference of Unitarians, realized where the energy and the future lie in Unitarianism, saying, and I quote, "The real life of our body is in the heretical wing. If we cut it off, there is nothing left to move with. My theological instincts and my Christian feelings are outraged by the rationalism of our young men. But as my whole practical nature and working instincts are equally outraged by the paralytic imbecility of our sounder and more Christian wing. I am not willing to rely on that for our future. We must resolve our difficulties and by ignoring our theological differences and finding in work a way out of our heresy and our deadness," end quote. Paralytic imbecility. You just don't hear that phrase too often these days anymore, especially when talking about your own churches. I mean, wow. But anyway, so in 1898, the Unitarians agreed to a statement of non-creedalism, and the Transcendentalists and plurality of theology was embraced by Unitarianism. So that was really when we first embraced pluralism as then a denomination, and when it became an association later. But I want to say we too, as a church, realize the benefits and effectiveness of organizing power and money, which is why each week we take an offering to support the work of this church. Please be as generous as you can. For those online, there is a link, or even here on your cell phone, there's a link to donate in the description of the YouTube video or on our website. Let this sacred time begin. read today is from an excerpt from Walden by Henry David Thoreau. We must learn to reawaken and to keep ourselves awake, not by mechanical aids, but by an infinite expectation of the dawn, which does not forsake us in our soundest sleep. I know of no more encouraging fact than the unquestionable ability of humans to elevate their life by a conscious endeavor. It is something to be able to paint a particular picture, or to carve a statue, and so to make a few objects beautiful. But it is far more glorious to carve and paint the very atmosphere and medium through which we look, which morally we can do to affect the quality of the day. That is the highest of the arts. Every human is tasked to make their life, even in its details, worthy of the contemplation of their most elevated and critical hour. And as well, if you would like to join the choir, Thursday nights, 7 o'clock is their practice. Even if you want to just try it once, you can do it. For Easter, is that still open? Okay, so if you just want to try it once for Easter, join in. If you like it, you can stay longer or not. Even if you like it and you don't want to go longer, you can do that too. But the living tradition which we share draws from many sources. The first source listed is, and I quote, "the direct experience of the transcending mystery and wonder affirmed in all cultures, which moves us to a renewal of spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life," end quote. You know, I sometimes wonder how many people sat in an office for how many hours coming up with just this precise wording as a way to express what they meant when they heard the word God, right? I mean, like, I think we are beyond the concept of God as an old man with a white beard hovering in the sky, right? But we should never be beyond wonder, magnificence, complexity, and the beauty of the universe that we live in. From sunrise and sunset to the sustenance that the earth provides us, to the smile of a newborn child. All of these represent to me the transcending mystery and wonder that renews our spirit. I think it's natural for us to want to better understand ourselves and how we relate to the environment. This search for understanding is what the Transcendentalists pursued. Now, one of the leaders, as we heard, of the Transcendentalist movement was Ralph Waldo Emerson. Emerson's father was a famous Unitarian minister who died when Ralph was 8 years old. Ralph's younger brother had a nervous breakdown just before Ralph entered ministry. And after just 2 years in the ministry, Ralph's wife died. Ralph left the ministry soon after his wife died and became a prolific writer and public speaker. And at least he still identified himself as a Unitarian. He wrote often about finding God within ourselves. From his essay, Nature, I quote, "In the woods, we return to reason and faith. There, I feel that nothing can befall me in life. No disgrace, no calamity which nature cannot repair. Standing on the bare ground, my head bathed in the blithe air and uplifted into infinite space, all mean egotism vanishes. I become a transparent eyeball. I am nothing. I see all. The currents of the universal being circulate through me. I am part and parcel of God." End quote. Transcendentalists did not believe that we could understand the universe solely through our physical senses. They stressed intuitive thinking and cultivating our inner life to discern truth. They derived much of their theology, as I mentioned earlier, from German idealism, especially Immanuel Kant and his 3 categorical imperatives. The first imperative states, and I quote, "We should act only according to that maxim by which you can at the same time will that it should become a universal law." Meaning if it's true for one person, it should be true for all people, whether that's freedom, healthcare, human rights, whatever you can think of, bodily autonomy. If it's good for one person, it should be good for all, a universality of ethics. The second imperative states we should act so that you treat humanity as an end, not as a means, meaning every person counts. We talk about the inherent worth and dignity of all people. This is where it comes from, right? And again, the ends do not justify the means. So it's about people's actions that count, not really the consequences, the actions. And how we act in the world, how we relate to each other. And then the last imperative states, the moral law is not something that imposes itself on oneself from without, but is an expression of our own rational nature. Meaning, we have autonomy over our morality. It doesn't come from a book or from out there, it comes from in here. So ultimately, it is about acting from our conscience for the good of all people. Now, some transcendentalists, just like in any movement, right, some focus just on the idea of an intellectual, individual pursuit of truth for self-improvement. But others, like Theodore Parker, believed that religion had to be connected to people's everyday life. Right? In addition to personal transformation, Parker as well wanted people to transform society at large. Like many transcendentalists, Parker took on many social justice causes in his lifetime. Most notable and ardent of those was the abolition of slavery. And he was not just about civil disobedience. He and many other Unitarians ended up funding John Brown, who actually, if you remember Bloody Kansas, John Brown led raids into Kansas to keep it slave-free. And as well, he always kept a gun in the pulpit, it is said, to prevent fugitives safe from slave catchers from the South. So he believed in backing up his values with actions. He believed also as well that poverty was an ill that society could work to eradicate. That was another thing that he worked tirelessly at. And Parker said, and I quote, and you'll recognize part of this phrase, man naturally, and humans, I did not generalize that, but this is what he wrote, man naturally loves justice for its own sake, as the natural object of his conscience. As the mind loves truth and beauty, so conscience loves the right. It is true and beautiful to the moral faculties. Look at the facts of the world. You see a continual and progressive triumph of the good. I do not pretend to understand the moral universe. The arc is a long one, and my eye reaches but a little ways. I cannot calculate the curve or complete the figure by experience of sight. I can divine it only by conscience. But from what I see, I am sure it bends towards justice, end quote. So often attributed to Martin Luther King, that was by Theodore Parker. Another one by Theodore Parker, which is attributed to Lincoln all the time, is a government by the people, for the people. That was by Parker as well. So considering where we are today, people continue to lose their rights with an increasingly wealth disparity, with laws to outlaw diversity. People can become fearful for their future. And so thus we must continually work to bend that arc towards justice. It doesn't do it by itself. As our first source says, we should be moved to a renewal of the spirit and an openness to the forces which create and uphold life. And what is the purpose of religion if not to help us come together, right? To worship together, to learn from each other, to make music together, all different kinds of music together, coming together and harmonizing together. Together we reach our full potential as individuals. We reach our full potential as a religious community. By coming together, we reach our full potential as humans. We're all in this together. We can only do this great task together. For although we may learn from within, these learnings, these expressions of love need to be tested, right? First within a safe, covenanted community, which we continually strive to be, and then we need to share those learnings with the world that so desperately needs our message. There's no easy answer, and there's no one answer. We must cultivate an ongoing attitude of active engagement within ourselves, with each other, and with the world. Are we searching for the sake of searching, or are we searching to find something, right? I think we are searching for how to build a beloved community. We're searching to how to make meaning in our lives in a complicated world. We are searching for our best selves. And these are some of the same questions, really, that the people in the 19th century asked and acted upon. And I am asking you to welcome each other, new and old, to welcome each other and others under our roof as we continue together the journey for which our religious ancestors laid the foundation for. May it be so. I invite you now to rise in body and or spirit for our closing hymn number 1007, There's a River Flowing in My Soul. Our closing words are from the Reverend John Buren, for excerpt from Conflagration. You may be a transcendentalist disciple if you care about nature as transcending yet nurturing us all. If you see materialistic greed threatening the sustainability of the earth as a home for our children and our children's children. If you care about equality as they did, transcending divisions based on gender, race, religion, class, and wealth. If you consider the affections as well as traditions as important in moral discernment. If you want religion to offer transcendent ends around which to unite for human survival and flourishing, rather than to require dogmas around which we humans are easily divided, then the Transcendentalists are not long ago or far away. They are actually quite near. Their hope lives on in us, who are variously inspired by their prophetic insight, courage, and example. Please join me now in extinguishing the chalice. The words are up on the screen. We extinguish this flame, but not the light of truth, the warmth of community, or the power of commitment. These we carry in our hearts until we are together again. Thank you all for your presence here today.